This video is for students who are looking for some additional explanations and some modeling of the skills practiced in day 14 of Unit 2, which focuses on the question, how did the agency of enslaved African Americans help to cause the Civil War, with the learning target of you being able to identify and explain the causal relationship between two sources related to abolition and to Nat Turner's rebellion. The introduction for this lesson includes three very different sources that you are going to kind of use to establish the historical context for what we'll be looking at in this lesson. The first two are tables, the second is a map, and the third is an image. And for each, you will be utilizing this see, connect, and infer protocol. It may seem simple, but seeing is probably the most important one, because the more you notice here, the more options you will make for yourself in these next two steps. And for some reason, this is the one that my own students seem to rush through, and then they miss things, which makes making inferences and connections that much more difficult for themselves. In fact, depending on the source that they are looking at, I sometimes inform my students that the majority of their time should just be spent on focusing on what they see, especially with tables like this, where there's a lot of data to observe and process. And in this table, or any table, you absolutely want to first focus on the title and the sourcing and the headnote if there is any, and then move on to the title of the columns themselves. I'm going to model this one with you, so the next one you can give a try on your own. For what I see in this table, I first notice the title, which is Population of the South, 1790 to 1860. In this first column, I see the years, which increase by 10 in each new row. Then we see the column for the white population, the free non-white population, and last, the population that was enslaved. Now, you can take a closer look by comparing the numbers either across the rows or down the columns and try to look for trends. For instance, if I went across the rows, I would see a snapshot in time for the breakdown of each of these individual years. Like in 1790, the top row here, I can see that there were way more white people in the South than free non-white and enslaved people, almost double the amount. And you can look at any of these years and try to notice those trends as well. However, if you want to see how trends change over time or how things change through the years, you can examine this data by going down the columns. For example, looking down any of these three categories, and you will see that each one increased every 10 years. Yeah, that's a trend, but it's really not that informative. Let's look a little closer and see if we can identify which ones increased the most and the least. Well, the white population went from about 1.2 million all the way up to just over 8 million by 1860. And the enslaved population went from about 654,000 to just under 4 million, which is a total increase of about 3.3 million. But look at this middle column. The free non-white population only increased by 220,000 over these 70 years, but the other two increased by millions. Now that I see this, I can infer that there were likely some barriers that prevented the population of free non-white people from increasing, maybe some laws or some social institutions. An inference is similar to a hypothesis from science class, which is basically an educated guess. And I can connect this to that letter we read at the end of our last unit from Benjamin Banneker, the renowned African-American scientist and engineer, to the letter he wrote to Thomas Jefferson discussing the inequality facing African Americans in the new country. I hope you see that my connection and inference were directly tied to me taking the time to see what the table was informing me of. Now, you should try this on your own with this table. The process with the map is very similar. Please make sure to always pay close attention to the key as well. There is lots to see in it. And on this slide, you're going to be asked to use what you learned from both the tables and the map to come up with one pattern or trend, which is basically like a big idea or a takeaway. Are there any connections between what you saw in the tables and the map of revolts and conspiracies by enslaved people? In case you are stuck, here's something you might want to consider. Can you find any of the states in that second table on this map? Did they have large numbers or small numbers of revolts or conspiracies? Is there a connection here that you can make between them? For the last part of this introduction, you are going to apply this technique one more time to an image titled, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? And I would recommend you heed the advice I gave. make sure you read the headnote and the sourcing information as part of what you see, because there is information in here that is going to be very relevant in just a moment. After doing this share out, you will be arranged into groups where you will use this image to create a definition for the word abolition, and then discuss how it utilizes something known as moral suasion, which I will explain in just a second. First, when collaborating with your group about the definition for the word abolition, you might have some outside knowledge or previous knowledge that you can rely on. However, I would also advise that you revisit the image headnote and keep an eye out for what it was originally used for, because I do think there are some clues there. All right, now let's talk about moral suasion, which you can see the given definition for right here. Suasion is kind of similar to persuasion, which is a much more common word that you've probably heard before, and they are related, although they do have some differences. Think of moral suasion as the action, the words used to convince somebody by appealing to their conscience, which we can see here is knowing the difference between right and wrong and good from bad. Persuasion can be seen as the effect. If a person is persuaded, that means the suasion worked. Anytime a person uses words to get somebody else to do what they know is right, that is moral suasion. It is a technique that Dr. King used often. Now, see if you and your small group can apply this concept and discuss how Am I Not a Man and a Brother depicts slavery using moral suasion, and you can record your responses right here. Upon your return, your teacher will likely have you discuss these two prompts. And remember when I said that moral suasion is the words that a person uses to convince someone to do the right thing? Well, this is an image. So for this second question, you should not only use the words that appear in the banner below the individual, but also the manner in which the artist depicts the figure. Everything you've done so far has been to help you establish the historical context for those two primary sources that we are now going to look at and determine their causal relationship. The first source is the Confessions of Nat Turner, and which before we start using in our writing, you must first consider its reliability. To help you with this, a sourcing and evaluating reliability tool is embedded into these slides. Again, just as a reminder, make sure you read the headnote. This is a pretty unique source, and taking a minute to read through it will likely provide you with some insight when you get to considering the author's perspective, purpose, bias, and audience. If you would like more elaboration on how to use this tool or to see it modeled, there is a separate video available. There are two check for understanding questions that follow. The first is asking you to apply the reliability assessment you just completed, and this one is designed to get you to start thinking about or even predicting how the government of Virginia, the state where Nat Turner's rebellion took place, will react. You'll then look at the second primary source, which is the acts passed by the Virginia legislature. And before reading and annotating it, keep these questions in mind, and you may want to use them as a guide for your annotations. You'll notice that the second question brings up moral suasion again, and the last two questions center on human agency. This third one is about how the Virginia legislature, the creator of this document, responded to acts of human agency, namely Nat Turner. And the last one asks you to think about how the actions of this legislature themselves are examples of human agency. To demonstrate your ability to meet today's objective, you'll construct a response to this prompt. Explain the causal relationship between the Confessions of Nat Turner and the acts passed by the Virginia legislature, making sure to bring in textual evidence from at least one of the texts. As you are doing this, you should strengthen your analysis by incorporating some of what you've already learned about causation. For example, does this relationship between the documents seem more reminiscent of long or short-term causes, or could it even be considered as a trigger? If you really want to challenge yourself, decide whether it resembles a necessary, sufficient, or relative cause. Remember, the skill of being able to analyze causation is meant to be practiced throughout this unit because it's going to be a pretty significant part of your summative. Speaking of the summative, the lesson ends with this check for understanding, which will definitely be useful as you prepare for your summative, which is still fairly far away. You may want to bookmark this so you can come back to it as you're preparing for it, though.